After a controversial and divisive tenure as a leader of Dalton and Thornton Township, Tiffany Henyard was recently jailed. Following her sudden downfall, the communities she led had to cope with the fallout from her administration. Henyard's presidency was marked by a series of financial issues, disputes with critics, and accusations of poor administration. Claims of questionable spending under her rule sparked concerns about how public funds were being handled. These issues eventually led to a thorough investigation that uncovered malfeasance, including allegations that public monies were used for private expenses and attempts to obstruct inquiries into her financial dealings. One of the more blatant examples that raised concerns was a $43,000 Amazon shopping spree that was charged to municipal accounts. This incident infuriated both locals and watchdog organizations, who viewed it as a blatant misuse of tax dollars. The community was outraged by yet another widely denounced choice, not only by the amount spent, but also by the seeming disregard for basic economic responsibility and openness. A $2 million project to build a township skating rink was overseen by Henyard. This project was the focus of accusations of reckless expenditure and financial irresponsibility. Given the apparent disregard for other pressing community issues, many residents questioned why such an expensive project was required. The rink was sometimes perceived as a vanity project because it was only utilized for Henyard's private gatherings. Henyard's administration was criticized for mismanaging township resources and neglecting basic responsibility in local governance, which fueled allegations that it was a taxpayer-funded attempt to improve her own reputation, rather than a genuine effort to improve the community. Over time, these concerns grew more intense, creating a distrustful and unsatisfactory atmosphere among the residents. When things ultimately get out of hand, federal authorities stepped in and investigated her financial dealings. The investigation found a pattern of action that suggested Henyard had embezzled public funds for personal use, despite the mounting evidence. The growing litany of accusations against her was augmented by this issue. Henyard remained stubborn during the probe. She reaffirmed her leadership stance and said she was the victim of attacks with political motivations. She even went so far as to announce her intention to compete for re-election in 2025, claiming that the controversies she was involved in were part of a larger scheme to prevent her from winning. Her bold claims, however, were unable to overshadow the growing evidence against her as the investigation progressed and more information became available. The failure of Henry was now certain. She was imprisoned as a result of numerous financial scandals, political missteps, and disputes with critics that plagued her administration from the start. The communities of Thornton Township and Dalton were left to cope with the consequences of her leadership, and residents were divided on how to interpret her fall from grace. Some said that her arrest was a long overdue moment of responsibility necessary to address years of alleged poor management. Some residents saw the investigation and the court actions that followed as an effort to bring transparency and integrity back to local government. However, Henry's leadership style was often as controversial as her ideas for those who maintained their faith in innocence, and did not accept that their once promising leader could have committed such serious misconduct during her time in office. Her style often caused her to fight with other local politicians and the Dalton Village Board of Trustees. These disputes were a constant source of drama and added to the township's dysfunctional nature. Henry's leadership style was marked by defiance and a determination to stick to her principles in the face of growing criticism. This made the community's issues worse by creating an environment in which cooperation and compromise were frequently unachievable. Despite these challenges, Henyard remained a contentious figure in Dalton and Thornton Township. Her admirers described her as a bold, innovative leader who was willing to take risks in order to improve the community. They pointed to projects like the $2 million skating rink as evidence of her commitment to provide opportunities for the community. But these supporters saw criticism of her government as politically driven and believed that Henyard was being unfairly singled out by her opponents. According to her detractors, her leadership was marked by her financial irresponsibility, lack of accountability, and tendency to prioritize her own objectives over the interests of the community. After all, the government was prioritizing itself in recent years. They scolded her for spending public funds on projects that seemed more focused on boosting her image than addressing the township's real needs. The $43,000 Amazon shopping binge and the controversial skating rink idea were perceived as clear examples of Henyard exploiting her position for personal gain. Henyard's leadership was also marked by a number of unmet expectations and failed initiatives. She had promised to rebuild local infrastructure, create new business possibilities, and improve public services. But many of these projects were canceled or delayed. Since the failure to keep these promises further undermined trust in Henyard's leadership and added to the perception that her administration was marked by incompetence and poor management, the investigation into Henyard's financial activities only served to make many residents feel even more betrayed. Evidence of theft of public funds was discovered during the FBI investigation, including allegations that Henyard had used township funds to cover personal costs. These revelations raise severe questions about the integrity of her leadership and the level of oversight that had been applied to her administration's finances. It's also revealed a pattern of behavior in which Henyard reportedly attempted to obstruct investigations into her financial practices, severely damaging her credibility and image as she faces serious legal issues in the months ahead. Dalton and Thornton Township will continue to be impacted by her leadership. The issue surrounding her administration has now forced the community's residents to confront the truth of her bad management and the repercussions of her actions. Others may view Henyard's arrest as a necessary step toward responsibility, while others may still question whether the whole extent of her crime has been revealed. Dalton and Thornton Township are at a pivotal juncture in their history. The once promising leader, whom many had thought would lead to progress and change in the area, has now become a symbol of political failure and controversy. As the legal actions continue, the residents of these communities will have to decide their future and whether they can rebuild the trust that was eroded during Henyard's stormy time in office. Given that Dalton and Thornton Township are already dealing with the consequences of her controversial leadership, Henyard's slide is a big shift for both communities. Easy to overcome, but her downfall has undoubtedly forced many to confront the need for more responsibility, transparency, and responsible government. Tiffany Henyard was formerly seen as a bright and ambitious leader, but her reputation will now be molded by the conflicts and scandals that ultimately led to her imprisonment and the collapse of her political career. Rising tensions, contentious leadership, and a growing number of issues marked Tiffany Henyard's tenure as mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thornton Township, which ultimately led to her surprise arrest. Over time, many of her once fervent supporters turned against her, particularly the township's board of trustees, who grew increasingly resentful of her leadership style, which they saw as being extremely centralized and obstructive. The efficacy of Henyard's administration was undermined by the toxic atmosphere she fostered with her combative remarks, charges of reprisal against her opponents, and incapacity to collaborate effectively with trustees. Her divisive actions, poor financial management, and charges of corruption placed the town in a state of uncertainty following her downfall. Conflicts with the residents and the Dalton Village Board of Trustees were common during her tenure. Meetings regularly deteriorated into chaos, and trustees accused Henyard of going too far and attempting to consolidate authority at the expense of transparency and collaboration. Henyard retorted on her side with charges of sabotage, and these discussions often became the focus of heated sessions. In one particularly dramatic incident, Henyard was heckled by both individuals and trustees and hurried out of a board meeting. As she walked away, she shouted, "You should all be ashamed of yourselves." This outburst portrayed a leader engaged in a never-ending battle, not only with her critics, but also with the greater political establishment that she had once belonged to. Both outside of the council chambers, where tensions were high, and on her social media sites, Henyard displayed her combative tendencies. Although some of her followers found solace in Henyard's frequent assertions that her critics were driven by jealousy or personal grievances, this claim seriously called into question her professionalism. She became well known for her live stream grants, in which she attacked her critics and labeled them as enemies of progress. These public outbursts often exposed her polarizing personality. Although some residents praised her resilience, others believed that, as tensions grew, her behaviors were unfit for an elected leader. Accusations of payback and retaliation began to surface. Some residents feared Henyard would exploit her position to silence critics and punish her opponents. Her critics accused her of attacking those who disagreed with her through lawsuits, public humiliation, or the purposeful use of township funds. This simply served to deepen the differences among the community. Henyard's supporters continued to hail her boldness and declare her a revolutionary. Her detractors, however, saw her as a leader who prioritized personal goals over the welfare of the team. By the time federal officials got involved, Henyard was leading Dalton and Thornton Township to become increasingly polarized. Many residents considered her incarceration as a necessary response to the realities of her divisive leadership. Despite her supporters' unwavering belief that she was unfairly singled out, Henyard's leadership had been linked to numerous financial mismanagement issues, personal retaliation, and rising political tensions after it was first praised as creative and revolutionary. Her arrest raised difficult questions about the community's future, even if it marked the abrupt conclusion of a divisive period in local politics. The seeds of Henyard's downfall were already sown in the early days of her administration, when her style of leadership created conflict among her own followers. Key allies, including the Board of Trustees, who first supported her plans but were turned off by her increasingly authoritarian approach, turned against her. Henyard's former assistant, Carmen Carlisle, became a vocal opponent of her leadership, accusing her of disregarding rules to achieve her own objectives. "She doesn't consult anyone. It's her way or the highway," Carlisle said in a recent interview. This view was held by a number of trustees who grew disenchanted with Henyard's leadership's increasing concentration of power and lack of transparency. One of the primary reasons for dissatisfaction was Henyard's tendency to miss board meetings and make important decisions without consulting the trustees. The mayor's lack of communication with the Board of Trustees, according to the township's opponents, undermined democracy and made it more difficult for it to function effectively. One trustee emphasized the importance of involvement and said that attending board meetings is essential. Regardless of your stance, you must cast your ballot. The already escalating tensions reached a breaking point when Henyard made significant appointments without the board's approval, further widening the gap between her and the trustees. One of the most controversial decisions made under Henyard's direction was the appointment of Ronald Burge as Dalton's police chief. Even though it was claimed that his state certification was inactive at the time, the trustees were incensed by this decision and said it was illegal to hire someone for such a critical position without ensuring that all necessary certifications were completed. A judge's later decision that Burge could serve in an interim capacity only served to intensify the power struggle that ensued between Henyard and the board. One trustee charged Henyard with exhibiting a blatant disregard for proper procedures. In addition, Henyard's administration was plagued by charges of intimidation, which came to symbolize the growing discontent with her management style. She came under fire for using her position to bolster her authority and silence dissent. These charges, along with the broader charges of financial mismanagement, painted a picture of a leader who was increasingly embroiled in scandal and alienated from the public. Henyard's combative rhetoric and unilateral decision-making further exacerbated the administration's sense of dysfunction by alienating those around her. Perhaps the most serious charges against Henyard are related to her handling of municipal monies. Trustees accused her of concealing financial records, forging signatures, and evading board approval to promote decisions and initiatives that suited her own interests. A former trustee referred to Henyard's tactics as a shell game and claimed that she moved funds around to conceal shortfalls and fund unapproved projects. What was first billed as a budget surplus was actually a facade for millions of dollars in debt under Henyard's leadership. This discovery was brought to light by the township's preliminary audit panel, which exposed a shocking lack of control and widespread mismanagement. Henyard dismissed the audit report as a politically motivated attack, claiming that her critics were only jealous and attempting to undermine her attempts to assist the community. She maintained her resolve in the face of growing criticism, rallying her followers with public events like turkey giveaways and holiday parties. These occurrences, which critics described as a distraction from the crises in her administration, allowed Henyard to continue portraying herself as the victim of a political conspiracy. Her aggressive speech and disobedience only made the divisions in the society worse. She regularly attacked her detractors on social media sites like Facebook Live, accusing them of being Judas figures, and threatening to sue all those engaged in what she said was a sophisticated scheme to damage her name. Many residents began to question her ability to govern effectively in the face of such serious charges, despite her supporters praising her resilience. The financial mismanagement claims struck at the heart of her administration's credibility, eroding trust among township residents and leaving the community grappling with the fallout of years of purported fiscal irresponsibility. Henyard's tenure ultimately became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. The combination of financial scandals, allegations of retaliation, and a divisive leadership style turned her time in office into a turbulent period for Dalton and Thornton Township. The once celebrated supermayor, who had risen to prominence with promises of transformative leadership, left behind a township mired in debt, dysfunction, and disillusionment. As Henyard's arrest unfolded, it sent shockwaves through the South suburban political landscape. Many residents of Dalton and Thornton Township viewed her downfall as a long overdue reckoning, while others, particularly her supporters, framed it as a politically motivated attack on a young black woman in a position of power. The FBI had been quietly investigating Henyard for months, gathering financial records and witness testimonies related to her roles in Dalton and Thornton Township. Reports indicated that the investigation had expanded to include her political committee and charitable activities amid allegations of money laundering and the misuse of public funds. As news of Henyard's arrest broke, reactions within the community were mixed. Supporters accused the FBI of targeting Henyard because of her position and her efforts to challenge the political establishment, while critics saw the arrest as a first step toward justice for years of alleged mismanagement and corruption. The investigation reportedly uncovered troubling patterns of governance, including the diversion of public funds for personal projects and campaign activities. Henyard's arrest left the future of Dalton and Thornton Township uncertain, with residents and trustees alike grappling with the aftermath of her controversial leadership. Calls for new leadership gained traction, with many urging the need to restore trust and integrity in local government. One trustee commented, "This community deserves transparency and responsible leadership. We need to focus on rebuilding." The question of what comes next for Dalton and Thornton Township remains unclear. Will Henyard fight the charges, potentially staging a comeback? Or has this marked the definitive end of her political journey? Only time will tell. One thing is certain: this dramatic chapter in the township's history is far from over. For many, Henyard's political career has left behind a legacy marred by scandal, controversy, and unresolved tensions. The unfolding legal battles and the continued scrutiny of her administration will undoubtedly shape her legacy and the future of the communities she once led. Whether she is ultimately found guilty or exonerated, the fallout from her tenure has forced Dalton and Thornton Township to confront the importance of transparency, accountability, and community trust in local governance.